For 89 years, one family in Wichita, Kansas, owned the company that lit America. They had built more than 50 million lanterns, and then, in 1989, they sold it. Within 10 years, it had been sold again. Within 20, again. Within 30, the company that made the most trusted light in America belonged to a corporation so buried in debt that its stock would lose more than 90% of its value. And the green lantern, the one your father pumped to life at 1,000 campsites, the one that hung in your grandfather's garage, it was still on the shelf. It just was not the same lantern anymore. This is the story of how that happened. And it did not happen the way you might expect. It was not a fire. It was not a flood. It was not some foreign rival who showed up one day with a better light. What took this company was quieter than any of that, and in the end, far more permanent. The name is still there. It is on the box at the store right now. What left was the one thing they could never stamp into the glass. If this kind of story matters to you, the real mechanism behind what was lost and who walked away with it, do two small things before we go on. Tap the like button because it tells the people who decide what gets seen that stories like this one are worth telling. And send this to someone who still keeps an old Coleman out in the garage. They will want to know. In the autumn of 1899, a young traveling salesman named William Coffin Coleman walked down a street in a small town in Alabama, and something in a drugstore window stopped him. It was a lamp. But it was not the dim, smoking yellow flame of the kerosene lamps he had grown up with on the Kansas plains. This was a hard, brilliant white light, and it was burning pressurized gasoline through a mantle. And it was bright enough that a man could read fine print beneath it. That detail mattered to William Coleman more than it would have mattered to almost anyone else, because his own eyesight was failing, and a poorly lit room was, for him, a closing door. He stood at that window and he understood two things at once. He understood that this light could change how people lived, and he understood that he had found what he was going to do with his life. He was 29 years old. He did not invent the lamp. That is worth holding on to, because the whole story bends back to it in the end. The light in that window had been built by another company, and Coleman's genius was never invention. It was something else. He bought the rights, improved the design, and solved the one problem that had kept lamps like it from selling, which was trust. People in 1900 had been burned before, in every sense. Traveling men had sold them miracle lamps that worked for a week and then died once the salesman was 3 towns away. So when Coleman arrived in Kingfisher, in what was then Oklahoma territory, he did not try to sell anyone a lamp at all. He rented them, $1 a week, and if the lamp ever failed to light, the customer paid nothing. No light, no pay. He kept the lamps running himself, walked the town servicing them with his own hands, and within weeks, nearly every shopkeeper in Kingfisher was burning Coleman light. He had not sold a product. He had sold a promise. And then he had kept it, personally, lamp by lamp. That was the foundation the entire company would be built on. And for the better part of a century, it held. He moved the operation to Wichita, Kansas. And there, he began to build not just lamps, but the place that made them. Walk through the doors of the plant at 220 North St. Francis in the years before the Second World War, and the first thing that reaches you is the smell. Cutting oil and hot metal and the faint sweetness of white gas, all of it hanging in the air the way it hangs in a place where things are actually made. Then the sound finds you. The steel presses came down in a rhythm you could feel in the floor before you heard it in your ears, each one stamping a ventilator hood or a fuel fount out of a flat sheet of draw-quality steel. The kind of steel soft enough to be drawn deep without tearing, and hard enough to last a lifetime once it was. By the late 1920s, the company had raised a 4-story building on that corner, and inside it, the work moved from hand to hand. One worker shaped the brass of the fuel system, graded by how much heat each piece would have to take. The next fitted a globe of borosilicate glass, the same heat-resistant Pyrex that would not crack when the cold rain hit a lantern burning at full flame in the dark. Further down the line, a pair of hands tied the mantle, a small sleeve of fabric that would glow white-hot when the flame touched it. Every lantern was a little machine of pressure and vapor and fire, and every one of them was checked, lit, and watched before it left. The people who built them lived within a few miles of that corner. They went to the same churches. Their children went to the same schools. For most of the 20th century, this building was the company, and the company was Wichita. In 1914, Coleman made the product that would define everything that came after. Until then, the bright gasoline lamp had been an indoor thing, a fixture for a store or a parlor. Coleman built one that could go outside. It was a lantern, sealed against wind and rain, throwing roughly 300 candle power of white light in every direction, far enough to push back 100 yards of darkness, and it would burn for hours on a single fount of fuel. It went where no light had reliably gone before. Farmers used it to work past sundown. It traveled to the South Pole with Admiral Byrd. And it became the thing a family reached for whenever they left the safety of the electric grid behind. That last part is the seed of the whole story, though no one could have seen it then. Coleman's empire was built on darkness. It sold light to the places that did not have it, to the farms and the territories and the campsites beyond the last power line. The mantle that made the light so brilliant was soaked in a compound that was, in those early decades, mildly radioactive, a fact the company would quietly engineer away generations later. But the deeper vulnerability was simpler than chemistry. A company whose fortune depends on the absence of electricity has made a silent bet that the modern world will not arrive, and the modern world always arrives. For now, though, the bet was paying off magnificently, and rural America ran on Coleman Light. When the United States entered the Second World War, the Army came to Wichita with a problem. It needed a stove, not a kitchen stove, but something a single soldier could carry, something no larger than a quart bottle of milk, something that would light and burn in the freezing mud of a European winter and the blistering heat of a North African summer, anywhere from 60 degrees below zero to 150 degrees above. And it needed it fast. Coleman took the problem and gave it back as a finished design in 60 days. They called it the GI Pocket Stove, the Model 520, and it weighed less than 4 pounds. It first went to war in November of 1942, when 5,000 of them came ashore with American forces in the invasion of North Africa. By the end of the war, more than 1 million had been built. Soldiers cooked on them in foxholes. They thawed their hands over them in the Ardennes. And the war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who slept in the same mud as the men he wrote about, devoted 15 of his columns to that little stove and ranked it, in print, just behind the Jeep as the most important piece of non-combat equipment in the entire war. The name carried so much weight among the troops that it became a password. A sentry in the dark would call out the word lantern, and the right answer, the answer that told him the shape in front of him was an American and not the enemy, was Coleman. Think about what that means for a moment. A company from Kansas had made a product so trusted, so woven into the daily life of an ordinary American, that his own life could hang on whether he knew the name. That is not marketing. That is something money cannot buy. And then the soldiers came home, and they brought the company home with them. The same men who had cooked on a Coleman in a war zone now wanted to take their families into the woods, and Coleman was waiting for them. The 1950s and 60s were the great American camping boom, and the Green Lantern stood at the center of it. If you are old enough, you already know the scene because you lived it. The car loaded down on a Friday afternoon. The campsite reached as the light was failing, and your father, kneeling in the dusk, pumping the lantern to build the pressure, the hiss of the gas, the strike of the match, and then that sudden flood of white light that pushed the whole forest back and made a small circle of the world feel safe. You did not think of it as a product. You thought of it as the light. It was simply there, the way the stars were there. The company made far more than the lantern. It made the stoves the families cooked breakfast on, the sleeping bags they zipped their children into, the tents they pitched in the rain. And in the 1950s, it took the heavy metal icebox that every camper had hauled and cursed, and it remade it in molded plastic, light enough for one person to carry, and the modern cooler was born. If you packed a car for a lake weekend in the second half of the 20th century, you almost certainly touched 3 or 4 Coleman products before you ever left the driveway, and you never once stopped to notice the name, because the name was simply the word for the thing. A Coleman lantern hung in what felt like every garage in the country, next to the workbench, gathering a little dust between trips, ready. You knew that if the power went out on a winter night, that lantern would still light. It always had. In 1995, the 50-millionth lantern came off the line in Wichita. 50 million. And on the green glass globe of each one, stamped into the Pyrex where anyone could read it, were 4 words that the people who bought them never thought twice about. Made in U.S.A. That was the promise, and it did not need to be spoken because it was molded into the glass. The man who built all of this into something permanent was the founder's son, Sheldon Coleman. He had gone to Cornell and studied mechanical engineering, and the story told about him was that he had walked the floor of the company's plant until he had learned to run every machine in it himself. He knew the work because he had done the work. Under his hand, the company became one of the largest exporters in the state of Kansas, a name known on every continent. The family held roughly a quarter of the stock, and for 3 generations, they had reinvested in the thing they had built, poured the profits back into the steel and the brass and the people on St. Francis. But somewhere near the top of that mountain, that began to change. The family had grown large, and the generations further from the founder began to look at the company less as a thing to tend and more as a thing to draw from. Money that had once gone back into the plant began quietly to flow out of it instead. From the outside, in the middle of the 1980s, Coleman looked invincible. The 50-millionth lantern was not far off. The name was a household word, but the people who looked closely at the books were beginning to see a company that was being lived off rather than lived in. And in the world those people came from, a company like that is not a legacy to protect. It is an opportunity. One decision changed everything, and it happened in 1989. By the late 1980s, the founder's grandson, Sheldon Coleman Jr., could see what the family had become. The company was being drawn down rather than built up, and he tried to fix it the way the era taught men to fix things. He attempted to take the company private, to buy out the rest of the family and run it as one owner. His offer was too low, and it came too late. And all it really did was hang a price tag on the company where the whole financial world could see it. And the financial world was watching. Ronald Perelman was watching. Perelman was one of the most feared corporate raiders of the 1980s, a New York financier who controlled a holding company called McAndrews and Forbes, and through it, Revlon, and a string of other American names he had bought, leveraged, and reshaped. He did not buy companies to run them. He bought them because their parts, sold separately, were worth more than the whole. In 1989, he bought Coleman for $545 million, and the 89-year reign of the Coleman family was over. What followed is the part of the story that has no villain with a single face, because the company stopped being a thing people built and became a thing people traded. And here is where you can see exactly what that trading cost, if you know where to look. For most of a century, the green glass globe of a Coleman lantern carried 4 small words molded right into it: made in U.S.A. It was never an advertising slogan. It was just a fact stamped into the glass, so obvious that no one ever read it on purpose. But across the years that followed, that fact quietly stopped being true. A man bought a Coleman propane stove and opened the box and found, printed on the side, 3 different words: made in China. He wrote to complain that the advertising had misled him, and the company wrote back and confirmed it in the flat language of the new era. That model, they explained, was foreign sourced. No announcement was ever made. No one stood up and declared that the promise was being retired. The lanterns and the stoves simply began coming from somewhere else, and the 4 words in the glass became, on most of the line, a memory. The soul of the thing had been quietly outsourced, one product at a time, and almost no one noticed the exact day it happened, because there was no exact day. That is how this kind of loss works. It does not arrive, it seeps. And once a company becomes a thing to be traded, the trading does not stop. Perelman sold off the heating and the air conditioning divisions, kept the camping name that everyone recognized, and in 1998, he sold Coleman again. This time, the buyer was Sunbeam, and the man running Sunbeam was Albert Dunlap, a turnaround executive so notorious for firing people that Wall Street had given him a nickname. They called him Chainsaw Al. He had made his reputation slashing tens of thousands of jobs at company after company, and the stock market had cheered him every time because every layoff lifted the share price. He bought Coleman to bolt its revenue onto Sunbeam and feed the machine. And then the machine came apart. Within months, Dunlap was fired, not for the firings, but because the profits he had shown Wall Street turned out to be an accounting fiction. Sunbeam collapsed into bankruptcy. The company headquarters had already left Wichita for Boca Raton, Florida. The lantern was now an asset in a failed corporation 1,000 miles from the hands that had made it. Out of that wreckage, in 2005, Coleman was bought again by a company called Jarden. Jarden was the creation of a financier named Martin Franklin, who had taken an old canning jar business and turned it into a machine for swallowing brands. By the time Franklin was done, Jarden owned more than 120 of them, name after American name, all gathered under one roof to squeeze out savings. Coleman, the company that had once been the entire identity of a Kansas city, was now one label among 120. It was no longer a company. It was a line in a portfolio. Then, in 2016, came the largest swallow of all. Newell Rubbermaid, run by a former Procter & Gamble executive named Michael Polk, bought all of Jarden for roughly $15.4 billion, taking on a mountain of debt to do it. Coleman did not just become one brand among 120 now. It became one brand inside a conglomerate of dozens of conglomerates. A small green light somewhere deep in a balance sheet that stretched from baby strollers to candles to kitchen gadgets. And the people who actually made things paid for all of it. In Golden, Colorado, the offices closed and the work moved to Chicago. In New Braunfels, Texas, the The plant that had molded Coleman coolers since 1980 shut its doors in 2022. 150 people lost the jobs that had defined their working lives. The work was consolidated away to save money the conglomerate badly needed. These were not abstractions. They were towns where a parent and then their grown child had both worked the same line, where the plant was the reason the family stayed. You can understand why on paper. A corporation drowning in acquisition debt has to find savings somewhere, and a plant is a number, and a number can be moved. The logic is airtight. It always is. That is the thing about a spreadsheet. It can measure the cost of a factory in New Braunfels down to the penny. What it cannot measure is the 14-year veteran on that line who knew the feel of a good seal by hand and who will never make anything again. It cannot measure what a town loses when the place that gave it a reason to exist becomes a number in a quarterly report written in another state. The savings were real. So was he. Today, the conglomerate that swallowed Coleman is itself coming apart. In December of 2025, Newell announced it was cutting more than 900 more jobs. The stock that had touched $55 a share in the months after the great merger now trades for around $4. Think about that arc for a moment. The whole justification for buying these brands, for loading on the debt, for closing the plants and moving the work, was that a giant built from American names would be worth more than the sum of its parts. Instead, it has been worth steadily less, year after year, and the men and women who lost their jobs to that theory got nothing in return for it. The machine that was built to extract value from American brands has spent a decade destroying its own, and Coleman has been carried down with it, a passenger on a ship it never asked to board. And yet, if you go to Wichita today, to a plant on North Hydraulic Avenue, you will find that something stubborn refuses to die. A handful of the old liquid fuel lanterns and stoves, the real ones, the ones that run on white gas the way they did a century ago, are still made there by American hands, in the city where it all began. The company even keeps a page on its website now telling you which products are still rooted in the U.S.A, as if the thing that used to be molded silently into every globe must now be advertised, because it has become the exception instead of the rule. There is something almost unbearably honest in that. The promise that was once so ordinary it did not need saying now needs a marketing page to survive. Most of what carries the Coleman name today is made somewhere else. In early 2026, the brand launched a collapsible cooler and spoke of moving beyond camping altogether, into backyards and sidelines, chasing a bigger market. The name is working harder than it ever has. It is just no longer sure what it is. So let us be clear about what happened here, because it matters, and because almost no one will say it plainly. Coleman did not lose its soul to a fire. It did not lose it to a flood, or to some better lantern built by a smarter rival, or to a public that stopped wanting light in the dark. It lost it to a deal, and then another deal, and then another, 4 owners in 30 years, each one a little further from the corner of St. Francis, each one seeing not a promise to keep but a value to extract. Nobody set out to destroy it. That is the quiet horror of the thing. Every single person in that chain was simply doing what the rules of the game rewarded them for doing. The light still burns. The hands that knew it are mostly gone. Before we close, if this story found you, if you have been carrying this feeling for years without a name for it, watching the things that were built to last get hollowed out one at a time, know that there are more stories like this one here. Subscribe, and we will keep telling them the honest way. all the way down. Stand at the corner of 220 North St. Francis in Wichita, Kansas. For most of a century, a 4-story building stood here, raised in 1929, and inside it, the presses came down before sunrise. The smell of white gas hung in the air, and 50 million lanterns were born. Close your eyes. It is a winter morning in 1950. The shift is changing. Men in heavy coats are walking through the cold toward the doors, carrying lunch pails, going in to make the light that the whole country trusts, the light their own fathers made before them. You can hear the floor humming through your boots. You can feel it in your chest. Now open your eyes. In 2011, they tore the building down. Where it stood, there is a parking lot. The lantern still lights. Nobody remembers the men who walked through that cold to make it.